All right, we still got some people coming in, but why don't we go ahead and get started? So hello everyone, thanks for joining us for today's webinar on growing DevOps maturity using feature flags. So I want to let everyone know a few things up top. One, we are recording, so if for any reason you need to drop early or maybe you have a colleague who's unable to join, please go right ahead and know that there's going to be a recording coming out, so don't worry about that. Two, you can ask questions. So as soon as you have one, even if you think maybe we'll answer it during the course of the session, please go right ahead and ask it in our Q&A panel. It's always good for us to know exactly what it is that you want to know about. And also, if everyone could, just to make sure that I know everyone can hear everything okay, please go right ahead and let us know where you're from, either the chat or the Q&A, and we look forward to talking to all of you today. To get started, we're going to be going over, as you can see, feature flags and the SDLC, feature flag-driven development, the COYOTE logistics story, feature flags and CI/CD tool sets, and then we have a Q&A session. We have a few speakers today. I'll be passing over to Nick Rundall in a minute, product marketing here at CloudBees. We also, from CloudBees, have a senior software engineer, Rafi. Rafi, you want to say a little something about yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. How's it going? My name is Rafi. I'm work with CloudBees feature flags. Yeah, I've been with CloudBees for over a year now and excited to talk about feature flag driven development today.
Great. And then also joining us, which is very exciting, is from COYOTE Logistics, which is a UPS company, the Director of Software Development, Russ Wilson. Russ, would you like to say a little something about yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, guys. Like you said, my name is Russ Wilson. I'm with COYOTE Logistics, Director of Software Development, and for COYOTE Logistics based in Chicago, Illinois. Got over 15 years of software development experience in several different industries, and I've been with COYOTE for almost 6 years.
All right. Before we get started, just a quick poll question for everyone. We can move on to the next slide, please. Perfect. So I'm launching the poll now. I'm going to keep this up for about 30 seconds or so, but just so everyone sees it, it's the how is your company using feature flags today? So you could have no usage, you're managing them with a homegrown, so in-house or an open source platform today, using a third-party platform, or you're not sure. And votes are coming in fast. I'm going to leave this open a bit longer. It's actually pretty interesting results thus far. It's been about 30 seconds, but we still have votes coming in, so I'm going to give this a little bit longer for everyone who hasn't voted but wants to. Let's call this maybe 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, show the results here. Nick, would you like to talk to these a little bit and then get us started?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Max. All right, so we've got about half the audience has no usage of feature flags today. So this is gonna be a very, very interesting webinar for you for kind of a new concept within the DevOps world. We've got about a third of attendees are using them with either an in-house system or open source, which is also very common for kind of where we're at today with feature flags in enterprise companies. Very few are using a third-party platform, which is understandable. And yeah, then there's the rest of you that aren't sure about 18%. So that is also understandable, especially if you're might be in a release role or something in shared services where you're just not sure what your devs are doing. Well, that's okay. We're going to kind of talk to all groups today with why feature flags matter within CI/CD, and even if you are in shared services or deployment or whatever else, they still kind of have a stake in that situation. So with that, I'm going to move into what are feature flags, and since there's about half of you that this is a new concept, I'm glad we're starting off easy. So for those of you that know, feature flags, they might also be known within your organization as flippers or feature toggles. At the most basic level, a feature flag is an if statement in your code. Very simple, right? If something happens, then something else happens. But the big change here is that you can make that change without redeploying in the application. It happens in runtime. Feature flags are not a brand new idea and have been used by developers individually for some time, but the big change in the market and why we're talking about this here, for a company that's big in DevOps, is that their usage, their management, their scaling across organizations. That this is new, right? This has only been happening in the last 5 to 7 years. Some of the big kind of titans of software development were the first to standardize this within their companies. Companies like Netflix, like Uber, like Facebook. They formalized the usage and they standardized them within their CI/CD tool chains. And this is the concept that we're talking about today. And this is what is rapidly growing within CI/CD. So a bit of a further primer, how do feature flags fit within the software delivery lifecycle? I'm going to show you something that, hopefully if you're on this call, this is nothing new, right? We have planning, we have design. The big 3 steps within CI/CD are, building, testing, deployment, and release. And I want to note here that deployment and release in this context is one step, right? It lockstep together. And that's important to note as we talk about feature flags. If you all are familiar with CloudBees, then this is really kind of where we play. This is where our solutions lie across CI, across CD, and now feature flags as well. And lastly, we have maintenance, which is let's make sure that it's working correctly, and if there are patches, we can change it. So this is the traditional SDLC. Unless this is day 1 for you within the world of software, this is nothing new. But let's look at how feature flags change the dynamic of the SDLC. Not much in planning and design, right? But where things begin to get interesting is within CI and CD. First off, with building and CI. CI is impacted with better builds with feature flags because you can eliminate the long-lived feature branches and the all too common phrase known as merge hell when you're merging all these feature branches together back into trunk at the new release time. It's been a headache for developers for years, and it's something that feature flags can largely improve. Rafi will talk about that more in his presentation. Traditional testing is kind of flipped on its head within this process to some extent, just because rather than having one linear way of testing across build, test, deploy, you can now kind of push it to production, and there's a reason for that I'll talk about in a moment. And that's not to say that release teams are no longer needed, or testing is no longer happening the same way, but we really have a new tool belt for how to test code out there today. And finally, deployment changes with feature flags too, because no longer is your entire release waiting on every feature to be completed at once. If you've got a major release coming out and you've got all features ready to go and 2 that aren't because they're more complex or for whatever reason, you can still release on time. And you can do that because you can take those incomplete features, wrap them in a flag, and deploy the rest of the release at once, and keep everything on time. This should make release managers very, very happy. So while these are great within CI/CD, really the big change here is what happens, and that is the decoupling of deployment and release. So this is a concept, like I said in the last slide. Traditionally these are steps that go together. Now for just let's standardize our terms, because I think across companies, even CloudBees, we kind of get these mixed up sometimes, right? So deployments are the technical act of moving code, right? But releases are the business decision of when customers receive that new feature. So, if you've got technology where these 2 steps have to happen at once, and that tends to be the case for most companies that aren't using flags, the development team and the business have to work lockstep in that motion. But decoupling, that it frees development from the needs of the business, and it actually opens up a bunch of new use cases to folks that previously were not possible. The first of which, this allows features to be, so everything is deployed, and it allows features to be released to subsets of users, whether they are internal QA testers in production. That's why I mentioned testing is permanently changed. Or it might be external real users that are selected to receive the release early, whether they're beta users, whether they are sharing it based on criteria like geography or their version, whatever else. But suddenly you're getting to test your code in production before the rest of the user base receives it. And this is a fundamental shift in the SDLC, and it's really, you know, a concept that you need to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation, because this is a fundamental shift of feature flag driven development. So I kind of covered the technical side of feature flags in a whirlwind. You know, let's kind of summarize the business benefits of what I just described, though, just so that, you know, we're clear on, yeah, that's cool, but why does this matter for your business? So, you know, to kind of summarize, right, feature flags, with what I just showed, it's big on reducing risk. So gradually testing in production allows teams to be certain of a feature performance before releasing it to all users. You know, this is no longer kind of the big bang release, no question marks around, you know, is something going to perform in production like it did in the tester environment or not. And, you know, by wrapping your features and flags, it provides the ability to implement, you know, essentially a feature kill switch to immediately roll back that feature without emergency patching and, you know, pulling all your devs off of whatever they're working on, you know, for a quick fix, right? Flags, you know, drastically increase developer productivity in a number of ways. You know, I've discussed that, you know, wrapping feature branches and flags allow them, you know, to push those features back into trunk, and merge hell is largely eliminated for good. Decoupling deployment from releases, you know, this, like I said, this frees up your development team from your business. You know, this should really make both sides of the house very happy, because no longer, you know, are they relying on each other's schedules as much. You know, developers can deploy a feature and then they can go immediately back to developing the next feature, right? And then the business gets to choose when they want to push that feature out. That's a very powerful concept. And you know, testing in production, I mean, this changes the way that you test a feature. This changes the way that QA teams might operate. And it's really, you know, a smoother way to test a feature, because, you know, you don't have to work on those edge cases in the test environment. You can push it straight to production and make sure it's going to perform on, you know, just like it would in production. You know, finally, flags help you shorten the feedback loops with users. And this is because new features can be released with confidence with, like I said, like either a targeted or a gradual release to real users. You know, this slowly allows these new features to be released and analyzed to new users. And what this equals is, by the time your entire user base has it, you know, if you're using it correctly and you've got your analytics set up in the way that you want, it means that you know, there's really should be no surprises with whether or not your users are going to accept that feature or not. And so this equals, you know, confidence. It equals higher satisfaction. If you release that feature into production and it gets, you know, poor analytics, poor reviews, you know, again, another concept of flag-driven development, you can go back to the drawing board, you know, before that feature got out and got, you know, the bad reviews, and, you know, the vast majority of your user base never even saw it. So, you know, if done correctly, you know, that equals better features that users love. And of course, you know, this results in things like higher user satisfaction, acquisition, retention, you know, all the things that, you know, the management and products and development teams care about. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rafi, and he's going to kind of do a deep dive on feature flag driven development using the concepts that I just described.
Hey, Nick, you guys can hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Let me see if I can start sharing here. All right. You guys see this okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. All right, how's it going, everyone? My name is Rafi, and I'm a senior software engineer here at CloudBees. I'm pretty much going to touch on a lot of the points that Nick brought up, and just kind of give you a perspective from the engineering side. So really, it's about what I'm going to talk about is embracing feature flags, how that impacts the Agile process, how to really develop a culture in your development team using feature flags. And so, yeah, I'll just start diving right into it. So yeah, again, a quick intro. My name is Rafi again, and before CloudBees, I worked at Recurly for over 4 years, doing subscription billing. When I joined CloudBees, I first worked with COYOTE and helped them with fraud management, and then moved over to the feature flags team And I've been with the feature flag team for over a year now, and again, worked on subscription billing, and now working on various projects with in regards to audit logs and a few other things. So so enough about me. So yeah, let's dive right into it. So really, I'm going to talk about what I think is traditional versus feature flag driven development, and give you guys a comparison of that. So let's talk agile. For me, agile is kind of what most teams are practicing in the modern software development cycle. So let's talk about the agile pain points. And I think there's a lot of processes in agile that take a lot of time. So I'm going to kind of talk about the flow of when product introduces a new feature. Usually, you know, you have a feature kickoff meeting. There's epic creation, and then you have your design teams, product and engineering get together. You have a series of discovery and grooming meetings, and then there are a lot of things to think about when you introduce a new feature. You have to think about infrastructure and stability, user experience, testing, CI/CD. And so these are some of the points that I really want to hone in on. Obviously, there's probably way more things to think about than this. But for the purposes of this presentation and the fact that I don't have all the time in the world, I'm just going to stick to these points. And then there's the ugly side effect of feature branches when you really start the implementation side of things. Depending on how big your feature is, what ends up happening a lot of the times is you have these big feature branches that are hard to maintain and can really be a headache for a lot of the engineers and the dev teams. So I'm going to go through these bullet points one at a time, and just first talk about the agile process, how it is today, and then add feature flags to it and see how the process kind of changes. And you have to kind of pivot your mindset and perspective a little bit once you start introducing feature flags into each one of these process steps. All right. So let's talk about infrastructure and stability first. Usually when a feature comes down from product, one of the first things that you have to look at are some of the low level stuff. So of course, this can be super time consuming, hard to predict, hard to minimize complexity. Some of the examples I'm thinking of are, you know, if your new feature is a whole new service, you have to think about like, okay, do I use Kubernetes? How do I actually host this service? And so Kubernetes, from my experience, and also with working with other developers, you know, it's pretty complex. There's a very steep learning curve, a lot of terminology like pods and hosts and containers and things like that. Another example is database schemas, right? How do you figure out object relation, the different models and the relationships and the tables and the foreign keys, and how do I index and migration? So there's a lot that goes on into the data structure of the feature that you're building. Memory caching, you want to make sure that whatever feature you're building is fast, right? You want to be able to serve it quickly. Do you use Redis for that or some other memory caching solution? And then queue services like Amazon SQS or Kafka or something like that, right? So I'm not saying, you know, every feature you have to think about these sort of things, but it's something that as an engineer, I think about these things when a new feature comes down the line. So, okay. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. User experience. So again, it's time consuming, right? How do you make sure that on top of the infrastructure and stability, how do you make sure that the customers actually have a good user experience? So, you know, especially coming from a subscription billing background, for me, you have these complex forms where you have, you want to make sure that when someone puts in their credit card number, you have proper validation. How do you expose certain UI elements and when not to? So again, it's hard decisions that you have to make early on in the agile process. when a new feature comes online. Usually you do this in grooming or discovery with the product and design teams, and it can take a long time. Also, how do you expose errors and edge cases, right? I think for me, errors are always a tough thing to handle, and edge cases, I think edge cases and errors kind of come hand in hand sometimes. Cool, let's move on to the next one. So testing, it's kind of a big deal. So you always want to try and achieve 100% test coverage, but from my experience, that's rarely ever the case. But it's something that, of course, you want to strive for. And depending on how complex your feature is, it's sometimes really hard to achieve. You have to deal with API fixtures, you have to deal with mocking, various complex application states that can be hard to achieve. Sometimes you need your test database to have certain tables and data in it in order to be able to provide proper testing, and that can be a hard thing to achieve. CI/CD. So in previous jobs, we had a release day at the end of our sprint. So this day was always, everyone had their eyes on Slack. People were monitoring performance, load on the database. I mean, release day was just a super stressful day. We were always wondering, okay, does that, are we going to have to stay and work the weekend after the release day? This was a very stressful thing. Production environments obviously a lot of the times are not the same as QA and staging. Production data is different. It's not the same as QA and staging data, amongst other things, right? You have environmental variables, and maybe your production data is containerized, but your QA and staging data isn't containerized. And of course, once you actually release something, there's costly rollbacks. So you release something to production, you didn't realize there was bad data in production, and all of a sudden your customers are getting 500 errors, or something else is happening. And this can take a long time to recover from. Of course, you have to create a revert commit, merge that, and all the code that your developers have been working on for the last 2 weeks is now gone, and you have to revert it. And of course, that comes with a real life cost, right? Perhaps you have an SLA where one of your customers was expecting a feature to be released by a certain time, and because of the bug, you have to tell them, hey, we need another 2 weeks before we can release it, right? So again, going back to the theme of time is money, right? And then you have the ugly side effect of feature branches. So these can grow into really big, ugly monsters. I've seen feature branches where, the number of files touched was over 100 files with over 1,000 lines that have changed. And it's like you look at these commits, and you're as a developer, you're like asking yourself, oh my God, where do I even start? How do I even review this thing? They require constant rebases against master. It can be scary if they divert from master too much. So if the engineer or your team, or the few people that are working on this branch, if all of a sudden they have to take PTO or they're not available, you don't want these feature branches to be diverting from master too much. And if they do, I mean, that can cause a lot of merge conflicts. It can cause issues with unit tests failing, and there's backwards compatibility issues. So if your feature branch introduces a new schema, a new table, or changes a column in your database, or anything like that, then that can really cause a lot of headaches here. So yeah, those are some of the points that I wanted, the pain points for Agile from my perspective. Let's introduce feature flags into the mix and see how some of these points, some of these pain points can be alleviated with the use of feature flags. So just to review again, this is the slide that I had at the beginning of the presentation. The 4 points I'm talking about are infrastructure and stability, user experience, testing, CI/CD, and the feature branches. So I'm going to go over these again, and we'll do a quick comparison of how feature flags can really help with these pain points. All right, got the double animation here. Okay, so again, let's go back to infrastructure and stability, but this time let's see how feature flags can really help us out here. So with infrastructure and stability, one of the tools that you can use with feature flags is you can roll out a feature to select group of users. So for example, start with internal users only. This can be your product team, your QA team, your design team. And so what this means is that this can really minimize risk around performance issues. So of course, let's say when compared to a normal release process, when your feature is released to potentially thousands of users, if not tens of thousands, you can control that now with feature flags. You can say, hey, I only want my QA team and my product team to look at this, or you can talk to some of your VIP customers or partners and open the feature to them. And of course, you don't have to worry about your infrastructure stack as much. It allows for piecemeal planning. So you don't necessarily have to think about the caching layer. You don't have to think about SQS. When you first release a feature, it's okay for the feature to write and read directly from the database. You don't have to have buffering layers, middleware in place that will help minimize performance issues. You know that it's only going to hit, let's say, 100 users or the select group of users, and you know that the database should be able to handle that. So later on, you can slot those buffering pieces in after you get feedback from product, from the customers, from the select group of users that you've exposed the feature to. And of course, it allows for better monitoring. So you see how the system reacts as more users are allowed to access the feature. So you can start with 100 users, increase that to 500, see how your CPU, how your memory is doing, how the read-write latency is doing, and then you can make a decision. Okay, I'm gonna increase the targeted group to 1,000 users and see how the database is doing with that. And if it's not doing well, you can reduce that that group of users back to what it was. All right, so the next thing, user experience. Of course, with feature, UX works great with UI as far as turning components on or off during runtime. So you don't have to make new commits, new PRs. You can literally change the UI on the fly in production during runtime with turning flags on and off. It allows for internal product teams to see the feature first, which is huge. And you don't need to build a feature through completely, and I'll talk about this a little more in the later slides, but when I was working on billing, subscription billing for the feature flags and CloudBees, you know, one of the things that I focused first on was the active subscribers. So if you think about the subscription life cycle, right, it goes from trial to active, and then you can expire it, you can cancel it. As far as the UI concerned, one of the first things that we wanted to offer our customers that provided immediate value was the active state of the subscription. So as far as allowing users to cancel their subscription or expire it or upgrade or downgrade, I didn't worry about adding those features, those UI components immediately. For example, we did have a cancellation button, but the cancel button was feature flagged, and when someone hit the cancel for their subscription, it brought up a little live chat modal instead of having to build out that whole flow of making an API call to the billing provider and so on and so forth. Instead, I just focused on the active state of the subscription. The user could sign up. It provided immediate value to the customer, immediate value to the company, And then as far as the other UI components, I just didn't worry about them. They were feature flagged. And again, it plays into the whole piecemeal planning part of this. Testing. So this Nick kind of talked about this earlier, but really you only have to test what is released and exposed. You don't have to plan for all the edge cases. So again, going back to my subscription story, I really only had to worry about the active state of the subscription. I didn't have to put in test cases for, oh, what happens when the subscription is expired? What happens when it goes back from expired to active? What happens when it goes from canceled to expired? I didn't have to think about every single step and state of the application. I really only had to worry about the active state of the application, and everything else was feature flag protected. So testing, the scope of testing was brought down substantially, and the amount of time that I had to spend on testing was also brought down substantially. Okay, next thing, CI/CD. So this is big, no more rollbacks. You just turn off a feature flag. If you release something into production, you don't have to revert it. You don't have to create commits. You don't have to go through the whole deploy process. You go to the feature flag in the CloudBees feature flag dashboard and turn it off, or you limit the users that can see that feature or use that feature. So this is huge. And going back to that story that I was telling you guys about, those weekly releases, you know, that stress is gone now. So from a developer side, this is really big. So again, yeah, like I just said, no more nerve-wracking release days. Just deploy to production immediately. You know that there's a feature flag, it's protected. You shouldn't have any stress around deploying master to production. Staging and QA are still there, but a lot of testing can also be done in production. And I know the phrase of testing in production can be, a lot of people frown down at that phrase, like how testing or production and QA and staging should be separate environments. But with feature flags, honestly, they give you that confidence of, hey, we can release this to production. Let's test things in production and see how the production environment handles this new feature. And then you've got the feature branches. So feature flags, I think, in my opinion, entirely eliminate the need for feature branches. Just throw a feature flag around a new feature and develop it in parallel with master. So whenever a new feature comes down the line, just throw a feature flag around it, and you'll thank yourself later. It's really nice to have that, and I think it solves a lot of merge conflicts. You're not butting heads with a lot of your teammates and figuring out, hey, when can I release this feature branch? You don't have to rebase it. So all the pain points that I was talking about earlier, you know, it really helps alleviate the issues with feature branches. Okay, so conclusions. These are kind of the takeaways that I want you guys to take away with from my presentation. So piecemeal design. I think with feature flags, there's takes away grooming and releasing. When you're going into a new feature, you're not spending as much time grooming the feature. The time from grooming to releasing is substantially reduced. You don't have to think about all the edge cases of the fully featured product. You can feature flag part of your features one piece at a time. The next point is think about targeted groups. So who should see the feature first? Can users get value from parts of a feature even though it's not fully implemented? So going back to my subscription feature or subscription story that I was talking about, You know, can you build the feature, one piece of the feature, so your users, your customers can get immediate value out of it? And then release continuously to production with low risk. Rollbacks are not necessary anymore, and you should feel free to merge to master and then deploy master whenever you want. Cool. So that kind of completes my talk about comparing Agile with traditional development, comparing that with including feature flags in your culture and your mindset. The next part of my presentation that I want to talk about is how does this impact the developer's relationship with QA and release teams. So I think feature flag protected features don't need immediate testing. I think that when you release it, you know there's a feature flag, it's protected. I think, of course, you want to go through QA and staging first and make sure that the feature flag itself is working. I think that's a good habit. And of course, locally, you want to test it. I think those conventions should not ever go away. But I think that your QA team doesn't have to go into production and test the feature fully. So it really gives, it helps the relationship with QA and developers in the sense that it lowers the time that QA has to focus on, you know, what happens in production. Your QA team can test small portions of the feature at a time. So you can tell the feature flag, hey, I want to give access to the QA team. QA team can log on to production and look at the feature without anyone else having access to that feature. QA can also turn features on and off easily. So, you know, again, if something gets released to production, your QA team can step in and say, hey, you know what? We think that this feature should be turned off right now because of X, Y, Z, which I think is an empowering thing for QA teams. This is also pretty big. QA doesn't need a local development environment anymore, technically speaking. I think it's still good practice for QA to have local environments to work with, but again, they can go into production and test things in production. People will have different opinions on this, but I think if it's a relatively small feature, it's okay for QA not to necessarily build everything they need for that feature in their local environments or in staging QA. They can go directly to production and look at it there. All right, and then my last slide here is just the culture shifts and stories with feature flag driven development. What I've noticed is that product teams are definitely happier. Features are delivered faster. We can test a product in real time in production with real customers. And I think that gives the product teams immediate user feedback, which is huge. Testing in production, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think people, historically, from my experience, people have, you know, my engineering managers have said, no, like once it's in production, there shouldn't be any surprises. But with feature flags, I think it's okay to go into production and have your QA team go into production, your product and design teams go into production and experiment and see how the feature behaves in production. Maybe there's some memory issues, maybe there's data that you didn't think of. And I think that's really, really useful. Merging to master shouldn't be so hard. You should be able to merge into master whenever you want. And y'all, my current engineering manager always says this, like, if you want to merge to master, go for it. If you want to go release something in production, make sure it's feature flagged, make sure it's looking good in QA staging your local environment, and release to production. It shouldn't be a scary thing. Planning a large feature shouldn't be as time consuming. Again, there's the phase rollouts and the piecemeal strategy that I was talking about earlier. And an example of this was the subscription billing that I talked about. And I did write a blog post about this, so I encourage everyone in this webinar to go check it out if you can. And again, very little merge conflicts, less headbutting amongst developers with what I was talking about with the feature branches. So I think with that, I'm out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me talk on and on and on. And I hope it was a useful presentation for people. I'm going to hand it over to Russ from COYOTE Logistics. Russ, let me know if you're ready to roll.
I think I'm ready to roll.
Awesome.
Sorry. So I see that there are a lot of questions that have come in on the question and answer session. I may answer a couple of them while I'm going through my presentation. I'm sure we'll try to get to them toward the end as well. But several of them came in when you were talking, Rafi. So if you want to maybe have a look at those real quick to see if there's anything you want to answer live, I think it's okay to do. One of the questions from Joydeep was when you were talking about some of the functionality for feature flags. You said Joydeep said so it's a canary release in a way, and yes, feature flags can be used to facilitate a canary release, absolutely, and oftentimes that's what will happen. So if you guys are okay, I think what we'll do is we'll just probably answer those questions after I get through my portion, and I guess I'll continue. So as we talked earlier, again, my name is Russ Wilson. I'm a director of software development at COYOTE Logistics, and I've been asked to talk to you about our experience using Cloud-based feature flags over the last year. We've been running it for just a little over a year, and spoiler alert, I'm really happy. So just to give you a bit of context about our company and how we do development, I think it's important for you to understand so that you can have a good knowledge of the type of development we're doing. So we are a global third-party logistics provider owned by UPS, as was mentioned earlier, also known as a 3PL. If you're still not familiar with what a 3PL is, that means we're a freight brokerage. If you don't know what that means, I can give you a quick overview of our business model. We have shippers. They are people who have product that they want to ship around the world, but they don't have a way to do that. We have carriers, which are effectively trucking companies that have big empty trucks and they want to ship stuff for people. So what we do is we put those two people together and we take a little bit of money off the top and everybody's happy. We have over 30 small development teams of around 4 to 6 people each spread throughout the world. Most of our development is done in .NET. Of course, we do have some Python and other things, quite a bit of JavaScript for our web UI, but most development is done in .NET code. Our biggest, probably our most important product is a Windows client that we use internally. We have 3,000 users that use it all day, every day. They hammer the crap out of this product. And it's the product that we consider to be our competitive advantage. But we do have several web offerings as well, used both internally by our employees and then also externally by those shippers and carriers I was talking about earlier. They use it to build their loads or track their loads to see where they are, that sort of thing. And another important thing to understand is that over the last several years, we've been converting our monolithic application into a microservice architecture. So that's been going on for quite some time, like I said, several years, but this is helping us to be able to make small incremental changes to our workflows, which is conducive to a mature CI/CD pipeline. So I'm going to go through what we used to do before we started to use cloud-based feature flags. When it came to feature toggling, that means creating toggles themselves. Oftentimes we just didn't use them, right? And I think it's self-explanatory as to why that could be a problem, but I'll give you a couple examples. If I don't have a toggle behind some functionality that I'm releasing, or when I inevitably break something, whether it be a bug in the code, throwing exception or something like that, and making it unusable, blowing up the application, or not taking into consideration all of the calls that are the resulting database calls or application performance on an application server. If I'm not taking that in consideration, I could take that down, which results in user downtime. But when we did consider having toggles, we did it usually one of two ways. We had config files, of course, and with 3,000 people using a particular application that is installed on their machine, if you need to make an update to that config file, updating 3,000 config files manually was obviously not an option, but even through scripting can take some time, especially when you're spread throughout the world. And then the other thing about those application or config files were that even if I did update those and I deployed those files, I'm unable to actually take advantage of that because our application was not listening for changes to those files, so we'd have to restart the application anyway. If we didn't, in the cases where we didn't want to use the config files, we wanted to use a database table because of the inconveniences of having to update all those config files. We eventually came to use a homegrown database table. Now you may think, oh, that's a pretty good idea, of course, but in our case, we never built any UI to be able to edit or add new values to this table. So we had to resort to database scripts for our updates. And in our organization, direct database scripts against a production database have their own approval process. So there's a lot of overhead to flipping those values or adding values to the database. So we may be waiting up to a day for that value to get changed. But similarly with the config files, the way we had implemented these feature flags or these feature toggles, feature settings as we called them, was that they had to restart their application to pick up those new values because our applications were not listening for changes to that database in the first place. So again, if we wanted to turn some functionality off, we'd still have to send out a company-wide email to ask 3,000 people to restart their application. Obviously, rather inconvenient. So that was talking about toggles themselves, but let's now talk about the rollout strategies that we used to have. Most of the time, to be honest, we gave little consideration to that. So as I was talking about earlier, there were times where you could just bog down an entire company or an enterprise database. We would write code, we would test it in our lower environments. We would say, yeah, we're good to go, right? With 4 people hitting the database or this new functionality. And then we ship to production. And I've got 3,000 plus all of our external users now using this potential functionality, and I've crashed an application server. And in order to be able to roll that back, I either had to have it behind a toggle or I had to redeploy code to roll back to a previous version. So to get a little smarter with that, what we decided to do was, instead of having no consideration, we wanted to try to pilot things. So what we would do is then we created a user cross-reference table for our employees, and this was something that was only available to our employees. So typically with that window forms application that I was talking about earlier, that's what we would use. So this is how we would use it. But that came with its own problems. Again, any changes to adding users to this feature or removing them, you'd have to restart the application. Also, it could only be used for employees. So if we wanted to turn a feature on for shippers or carriers or what we call our external users, we'd have to use a config file of some sort. And again, no UI was ever built for this new cross-reference table. So again, more SQL scripts, more overhead. And again, the app starts were certainly required, as I mentioned. So what do we do now? As I mentioned earlier, we use cloud-based feature flags. So for feature toggling, first thing we do is we create a flag in cloud-based feature flags, and then we just consume it from the code. Cloud-based has an excellent client library that we take advantage of, and it really does seem to be quite seamless. And then the other thing is that we're able to toggle it at our leisure with no database scripts and minimal red tape. Now, when I say minimal red tape, we still have some, only because it's self-imposed, because we do have an application support group who want to be aware of any production changes that are going to be happening, so they can be prepared for an influx of calls to our service desk. The good thing is that when they do start to get calls, instead of having to redeploy code to an older version, we flip a toggle and everybody's happy. The other thing that's important is that we no longer only read the toggle value or the flag value, I'm sorry, when we open up the application, we read it live. Sometimes there's some local caching that we can do to read it only every so many seconds or whatever, but typically it's a live read. So we can get the quickest, change in functionality as possible. So let's talk about, those were the toggles themselves. Let's talk about how we want to roll them out now. The first thing we do with any new feature is we consider how it should be rolled out. When I say how it should be rolled out, I mean, do we just want this to be a typical oh crap button feature toggle, meaning I'm just going to turn it on for everybody. And if anything goes wrong, oh crap, turn it off, right? That is most, sorry, not most, but many, many, many of our toggles. It's a traditional way to do something. Feature flags can be used as that oh crap button. However, in order to be able to experiment or to be able to roll out slowly, we have come up with several different types of context that we want to release features by. For example, we want to release features by employees. But getting even more granular, sorry, employees rather granular, maybe I want to turn on an entire company office. I want to turn on our Detroit office so we can get the feedback from the Detroit office folks before we then turn it on for all of our other offices. So we're only potentially affecting a very small subset of our users. We can turn it on by user division, users managers, things like that. Similarly with shippers and carriers. If we want to turn on features for only a certain set of carriers that are located on the East Coast, or some shippers that are located on the West Coast, to see if they're going to be using this functionality more than what we were expecting. And we have several other ways that we can do it that we've implemented. But another way that I think is important to mention is a percentage-based rollout, or sorry, yeah, percentage-based rollout using what Cloudbees Feature Flags calls their stickiness property. So the idea is that with each request, you provide what we call a unique ID, so that deterministically, Cloudbees can determine that this ID is always going to get the same value. But the idea is that with 25% of the calls that are coming in against this flag, 25% is true, where the rest is false, or 25% are red, where 25% are blue, and the rest, the 50%, are black, something like that. And we've used that to great effect. So then once you've considered how you want to roll these features out, you then set the flag logic up in the Cloudbees Feature Flags UI, and just the magic happens. You start to see the impressions come in. So one of the things that really we were looking for was the ability to be able to have a mature CI/CD pipeline, and feature flags is a core pillar of being able to have that. So we did actually see a huge development culture shift. As you heard earlier, we were able to separate our code deployments from our feature releases. In the past, deployment and release were synonyms. They are no longer synonyms in our organization. Feature toggles are now expected for any new features. It's too easy to implement to not have a feature flag, and adhering to this process is mandatory. It's policed effectively by, we do have pull requests that we have to have. Typically 1 to 2 developers on a particular team must review any new pull request before it gets merged to the master branch. And then what we do is we never deploy our code with the feature on the first time, right? So most likely, if you're going to be developing a new feature, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a flag, and you're going to put that if statement in there, and then the if on is going to have nothing in the if statement, and the else is going to be your current functionality, so that you're quite sure that you're going to be able to go back in time effectively to a state of your functionality that is expected and working properly. By having the feature flags turned off, and having this new functionality behind feature flags, we're able to ship code sooner and do it in an iterative fashion, which again is conducive to a mature CI/CD pipeline. Releasing our features can now be done deliberately and with forethought. So we're able to ramp up, like if I'm rolling out something for an employee, for all employees of the company, but I want to start with a subset of users, we can ramp up at an agreed upon pace to allow for our infrastructure and application performance monitoring using our APM tools. So if I don't think I'm going to now take down a database, but I start to ramp up slowly, I turn on Detroit, then I turn on Atlanta, and I start to see some database pressure, I can almost immediately take off the Atlanta office, right? And only run on Detroit because it was running fine, that sort of thing. It allows us to analyze results and the performance of the new functionality without infecting the entire user base, just like I was saying. And it allows us to get feedback on new features from that subset of users, which would allow us to then pivot if we need to. Maybe this functionality isn't really working out the way we had thought. Well, we didn't just affect all of our users, only a certain subset. Using feature flags give our product owners and our dev teams more confidence to experiment. Just like I was saying, we can roll a feature out, see how it's being used, see if it's doing what we were expecting it to do, or if we need to now pivot to something else that may try to solve the problem in the way that we want to solve it. Using them also improve the reputation of our development teams. In the past, like I mentioned, we could have potentially brought down the entire functionality of this. So we were affecting 3,000 users potentially at any one time, and they could do nothing until we had the problem fixed, which could be hours and hours before we could do that. Our fallbacks at this point in time are minimal, meaning fallbacks meaning rolling back our code, so where we actually had to deploy an older version of code. And our user downtime, like I mentioned, is down because I no longer have to redeploy code. I just turn off a flag. So it's seconds, maybe minutes, where I get you back to a working state versus hours potentially. And then, to be honest, really it helps me sleep better at night. In the past, after 3 tiers of support, I may get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning, and typically what I have to do is get up and go fire up the PC and try to help debug the issue. Now it's, oh, did you guys turn off the toggle? Because you should do that. We can talk about this when we get to the office, that sort of thing. So it helps me sleep better at night. I want to give you a couple of lessons that we've learned and things you can expect. Implementing a feature flag solution can be turnkey. Cloud-based feature flags makes it extremely easy to do that. But I caution you to just immediately jump in. There are some things you should consider. In our case, we do have different development environments. We have like a dev, several different staging environments. We have an integration testing environment for our CI/CD pipelines, and we also, of course, have our production environment. It's important to give that some consideration. It doesn't take too long, but you might want to consider how you and your organization do your development. And if you have different environments, you'll want to set those up separately because you're able to create the flags in your development environment and then clone them to your upper environments as your code moves along in its development cycle. Next, I would encourage you to come up with naming standards for your flags. If we have 30 teams, if I didn't have a naming standard, we'd have flag names all over the place. But by having a standard, we are able to look at the flag name and almost immediately know what workflow that flag is a part of, so that we can then contact a particular team to see if we see anything wrong, or if a flag's been sitting out there stale for so long, we can ask them to obviously remove that flag. And then one of the other things that you should do before you really start is consider the context by which your users will be using the flags. Like I mentioned earlier, how we can turn users on in particular offices, or we can turn on shippers based on their geographic location. That was a conscious effort on our part to try to give some forethought about how we might want to roll out any type of feature, so that we're able to be prepared for when that comes. And keep in mind that type of context will evolve quickly. You'll try to come up with the best list you can come up with, but trust me, other folks will come in. Oh, can we deploy only to X type of user or X type of machine or something like that? And you're like, oh, I never thought about that. That's great. Jay, I'll get to your question here in just a second. I'm sorry. One thing is that it will take some time to convince everyone that the overhead is worth it. When I say the overhead, I mean creating the flag, having to potentially add extra code, just a couple lines really, but it's technically overhead to your code base. But then also going back and cleaning up your code, because once your features rolled out to everyone, then you no longer need that flag. So it's important for you to go back into your code base, remove that if statement, remove that else statement, because your new functionality is there and working, and you no longer need to have those calls running out to Cloudbees. And then championing the use of feature flags will give you a sense of pride after your first rollout. I know that happened to me. The first time we actually got to use this thing in production, there's a sense of pride on my side, only because our application support said, whoa, that was way different. That was so much easier. Fortunately, we didn't have any issues with our first rollout where we actually had to roll it back, but literally turning it on was something that was different for them because we didn't have to wait a day for that SQL script to happen to be approved, that sort of thing. So they were very happy with it. Now, when we had issues where we had to roll it back, that's even better. They are like, oh crap, just roll it back, click a button, and everybody's back to normal. It's been fantastic. And then really the last thing that I think is important for you to understand is that the impressions metrics will give you more than you were expecting. So in CloudBees rollouts, you can actually look at your flags and you can see how many times those flags have been accessed, in addition to what the percentage value was for the percentages of each of the values. So if you have a traditional toggle, a true on off, you'll see it was 50% true, 50% false for the last X number of days over so many thousands of impressions. And if you have what they call a variant, you could have 40% were red, 20% were black, and 40% were blue, that sort of thing. So those impressions will give you more than you were expecting, because once you're able to visualize that, for me in my case, when we saw that we had way more impressions on a particular flag than we thought, that allowed us to then say, oh, I should probably put this functionality potentially behind some sort of cache, or maybe this is information that I've never seen before, and I want to now start to log this in my application to now be able to build more APM dashboards, that sort of thing. So just to give you, I know I'm running up against my time here, just to give you a little bit of a proof of progress that we have and some live stats. We've had a 46% year-over-year increase in deployments. Keep in mind that we did have we're 6 months into the year, and right when COVID hit, we had a 3-week moratorium on deployments because we wanted our systems to be extremely stable with the transition to out of the office work. So that number technically would have been higher had we not experienced the pandemic. We've had a 39% drop in fallbacks year over year. So fallbacks, again, that is not necessarily turning off a toggle, but it's a 39% drop in having to redeploy code to fix an issue, meaning redeploy it back to an older version. And of course, if you have an increase in deployments, a decrease in fallbacks, you're going to have the ratio is going to have gone down. So that's what this number represents, almost a 60% drop in our deployment to fallback ratio. This slide says we have 73 active production experiments. We actually have 79. I checked right before we went live today, and this says we have 100 flags in development. We actually have 108, but I'm literally about to add 20 more when I get off the phone, or sorry, when we get off this presentation, given a conversation I had earlier this morning. And the fact that I can just add 20 flags without any concern should tell you how easy it is to do and how confident that we are in the product. And then one last number for you, which I don't have a slide for, is that in the last 24 hours, we've had over 2.5 million impressions on flags. That is hits against our flags in our production environment alone, and CloudBees feature flags hasn't missed a step. So like I said, we are extremely happy with the product. And I think I'm done.
We have a few more slides just talking about feature flags and the maturity level within CI/CD. So I realize we're over. I hope everyone is finding this useful. And if you do need to jump, completely understand, and you will be getting the recording after this. One more note on questions. We've had a ton of questions on this call. We're going to be going through all of them that we haven't hit kind of in real time, and we'll be following up with you after the event. So you won't be ignored. Please stay tuned. But very quickly, looking at the maturity of feature flags within CI/CD, because I think a lot of you are new to feature flags, but you're definitely not new to CI/CD. So kind of how we see this going within most organizations. Stage one within feature flag maturity, this is feature flags being used in standalone development, within silos within the organization, right? They're being used by developers for those standard benefits within CI/CD, the risk reduction, the being able to see how it performs in production, all that sort of thing. And these tend to be used, either like Russ had in his kind of beginning of his journey with a homegrown management system, or even none at all, right? And this is just standalone developers using these tools. Okay. At some point, just like Russ did, and just like the vast majority of our customers do, they realize that, if we're really going to scale this and standardize this and create the idea of feature flag driven development, we have to have a platform for scalability. We have to have a platform for visibility and common governance, like across the organization. This is really where, standardizing feature flag driven development starts. This is where most companies, not all, they either kind of double down and they invest in their own homegrown system, or, they look externally. They look at a company like ours or some of the others on the market, that have kind of an out of the box enterprise management platform. Where I think things get really interesting, and this is where things get really interesting for everyone, kind of within any part of the CI/CD process, is what we're labeling as enterprise progressive delivery, or CI/CD++. The name is still kind of out there. We're happy to take any recommendations, but this is where organizations look at ways to tie their current CI/CD tool set and feature flags together for common visibility and shared process creation. This integration emphasizes and solidifies feature flag driven development, and it should be providing more value across CI/CD tool sets as a whole. So for example, here at CloudBees, we've done a lot of work to integrate our feature flag in our continuous delivery tool. So one new unlocked use case by integrating these tools is that you can now automate the release of a feature versus, previously it was the release of a version only. So you can now completely automate and orchestrate the features within a release, and versus just a version. It's just new value, new use cases. Now, like people using both tools here at CloudBees, that they can see the flags, within their CD tool versus they could before. So this is where we're headed, and kind of, the holy grail, as we say, and kind of, what this is going to equal long term is that, a place that most companies aren't today, but we're convinced, here at CloudBees, that this is where the market is going. This is the ideal feature state. This is what we're calling enterprise feature lifecycle management. And this is where, feature flags are utilized across planning, design, your CI/CD tool set. This is really about the organizational shift taking place, where you move from looking at, coding products to coding features, and having the granularity and visibility to look at the impact of that feature, seeing from planning all the way to, release and maintenance, of the impact of that feature. And it's a shift, to the granularity at the feature level. Obviously this takes, this is easier said than done as well. And this is why, we're kind of seeing this as the ideal future state. For us at CloudBees, we're doubling down on this idea with our software delivery management platform, which takes, a common look and common visibility and governance across all of your CI/CD tools at once. So that's where we're headed. This is kind of, a general idea, kind of look at where your company is at today, with feature flags and CI/CD, and, kind of keep this in your back pocket as you look at maturing. Our very quick kind of commercial, for most of you that it seems like are in that kind of first stage of, we know what feature flags are, but we're probably not using them at, the management level. We do have it, our enterprise management platform, we call it CloudBees Feature Flags. That's what Russ is using today. And it's going to kind of expedite that maturity scale a bit for what we're talking about. If you do want to try it, we do have two versions. We're the only tool on the market that has both a SaaS version or a self-managed version for on-prem use cases. So, we're happy to let you try both. If you do want to try the SaaS version, you can have a solo user use it forever. We have kind of a freemium model there. So please give it a look if you'd like. And the last kind of shameless plug here, right, is this is kind of the summer of feature flags at CloudBees, and our next webinar is going to be at the end of July, and this is where we're going to take a deep dive looking at continuous delivery using feature flags. What Rafi talked about with, how does QA interact with feature flags? How does the delivery situation look different? All that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that event, we'll send you the link in the follow-up email, and we hope to see you in July. So with that, thank you for your attention, and certainly your extra attention. We hope this was useful. Thank you for all the questions. And like I said, for all those we weren't able to answer in real time via chat, we'll be following up with you after the event. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.